Hi history lovers, and welcome back to the channel where I bring you new videos every Friday on all aspects of the past. Today on History Calling we're looking at the groundbreaking funeral of Queen Catherine Parr and at the later disinterments, plural, and shocking mutilation of her body. Other than what happened to the Russian Romanovs, which you can hear about in my video on them, linked on screen and in the description box, the fate of Catherine's remains is one of the worst cases of grave and corpse desecration I've come across for a royal, and by the end of the video, I think you'll understand why. If you like this kind of content, I already have videos on the executions and disinterment of Queens Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard and the funerals of Jane Seymour and Anne of Cleves. These are all linked below for you. Please also take a moment to subscribe to the channel with notifications switched on so you never miss an upload, give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. You can follow me on Instagram too, where my username is History Calling. There's a link for that in the description box as well, alongside links to books, movies and TV shows about Catherine's life. I'm not going to spend much time here on Catherine's biography, as I already have two videos which cover this and which are linked in the description box. Suffice to say that although raised a Catholic, she had converted to Protestantism during the course of her life, and this was the religion she died in 1548 at the age of 36. Catherine had married 4 times. Her third and most famous husband was Henry VIII, but after his death in 1547 she wed Thomas Seymour, who was a brother of Queen Jane Seymour, Henry's long-dead third wife, and the mother of the new king, young Edward VI. Catherine gave birth to their daughter, Mary Seymour, who was named after her stepdaughter Princess Mary and who was Catherine's only biological child, here at Sudeley Castle on the 30th of August 1548, dying from childbirth complications between 2 and 3 a.m. on the 5th of September. Her husband was disgraced the following year when he tried to seize control of his nephew, King Edward, and was ultimately executed on the 20th of March 1549. Their little girl was sent to live with Catherine Willoughby, Dowager Duchess of Suffolk, who had been the wife of Henry VIII's great favourite Charles Brandon. However, she disappears from the records as a toddler and presumably died young. Catherine's body was quickly embalmed, wrapped in cerecloth, which is cloth coated in wax to make it waterproof, and placed in a lead coffin, with a lead plate over the top of her chest, which read, K.P. Here lieth Queen Catherine, wife to King Henry VIII, and last the wife of Thomas, Lord of Sudeley, High Admiral of England, and uncle to King Edward VI. Died 5th of September, 1548. The body remained in her privy chamber in the castle while preparations were made for her funeral, which took place in the castle's chapel, where she was also buried, on the 7th of September. This was a very speedy burial. Usually there was a gap of several weeks and a lengthy lying in state before a royal was officially laid to rest. What was more, the service itself was unlike anything ever seen for an English royal. According to a contemporary description of the funeral, the chapel had been, quote, hanged with black cloth, garnished with escutcheons of marriages, viz. King Henry VIII and her, Catherine, in pale under the crown, her own in lozenge under the crown, also the arms of the Lord Admiral, that's Thomas Seymour, and hers in pale without crown. Escutcheons, if you're unfamiliar with the term, are essentially shields showing coats of arms, while pale and lozenge refer to the shape of each escutcheon. Having Catherine's arms shown in a lozenge when they were depicted on their own denoted that she was female. The rails were also, quote, covered with black cloth for the mourners to sit in, with stools and cushions accordingly. The Protestant nature of the ceremony starts to become apparent as the description continues. Usually, the body would have been placed beneath a hearse, which in that era meant a structure put over the top of it and ornamented with a pall and candles, aka tapers. In Catherine's case, however, no hearse was used, nor were there any majesties valance or tapers, saving 2 tapers whereon were 2 escutcheons, which stood upon the corpse during the service. Compared to a traditional Catholic ceremony for someone of Catherine's rank, this was a very simple setup, and if you see my videos on the funerals of Jane Seymour and Anne of Cleves, both of whom had Catholic ceremonies, you'll note the differences. The corpse was carried into the chapel in a procession in the following manner. First, 2 conductors in black with black staves, then gentlemen and esquires, then knights, then officers of household with their white staves, then the gentlemen ushers, then the Somerset herald in the king's coat, then the corpse borne by 6 gentlemen in black gowns with their hoods on their heads, then 11 staff torches borne on each side by yeomen about the corpse, and at each corner a knight for assistance, 4, meaning 4 knights in total, with their hoods on their heads. Then the Lady Jane, daughter to the Lord Marquess of Dorset, chief mourner, led by an estate, her train borne up by a young lady. This is the 10-year-old Lady Jane Grey. Then 6 other lady mourners, 2 and 2. Then all ladies and gentlewomen, 2 and 2. Then yeomen, 3 and 3 in a rank. Then all other following. With the coffin placed within the railings and all the mourners in their assigned spots, the service began. The choir sang some psalms in English, the choice of language, as opposed to Latin, being another clear marker of a Protestant service. 3 lessons were then read, after which the mourners went, in order of rank, to give a donation into the church's alms box. Now Dr. Miles Coverdale, who had been Catherine's almoner, stood up to give the funeral sermon. The service was so unusual that he had to make a point of explaining what certain elements of it did and did not signify, telling the assembled personages that the money they had donated was for the use of the less fortunate, and would not profit the dead in any way, a reference to the money often set aside by Catholic royalty and those able to afford it to have prayers and masses said for their souls. Coverdale continued that the lighted tapers in the church and around the body were also for the honour of the person, and for none other intent nor purpose. When the sermon was done, Coverdale prayed and the congregation answered, after which Catherine was buried to the sound of a Te Deum being sung, in English once again, by the choir. The account of the funeral concludes that, and this done, after dinner, the mourners and the rest that would returned homeward again. The whole thing, procession included, had taken just 1 morning, again a noticeable break from convention. As an adherent of what was called the Reformed religion, we can only hope that Catherine would have approved. An alabaster monument was erected over her tomb, with a Latin inscription written by her chaplain, Dr. Pankhurst. This monument is very possibly the one depicted in this image, published in 1582 and labelled Q. Catherine, meaning Queen Catherine. Certainly Catherine Parr was the only Protestant English queen to have died up to this point who would have had a tomb. I find this slightly flowery English translation of the inscription, which has taken some liberties in order to make the whole thing rhyme, but it gets the general idea. It reads, "In this new tomb the royal Catherine lies, flower of her sex, renowned, great, and wise, a wife by every nuptial virtue known, and faithful partner once of Henry's throne. To Seymour next her plighted hand she yields, Seymour who Neptune's trident justly wields. From him a beauteous daughter blessed her arms, an infant copy of her parents' charms. When now 7 days this infant flower had bloomed, heaven in its wrath the mother's soul resumed." No doubt Catherine would have been quite happy if this had been the end of the story for her earthly remains. Unfortunately, it wasn't, and what happened to her body in later centuries was increasingly appalling. For 234 years, the body of Catherine Parr lay in peace. Her former home and the chapel in which she had been buried fell into rack and ruin. Her original tomb was lost, and the exact location of her grave was forgotten by many and became an issue of hearsay. In 1782, however, grave hunters decided that this wasn't good enough, and that they wanted an answer to the question of exactly where the Queen lay. This is where the disgraceful treatment of her remains began. In May of that year, some female visitors to the castle, who had read that Catherine was buried in the chapel there, decided they wanted to see for themselves. The land was now owned by a Lord Rivers, but there is no indication as to whether they had his permission to have the site dug. Instead, as near as we can tell, they showed up and, upon seeing a piece of alabaster in the corner of a wall, which they determined might be part of the tomb effigy I showed you earlier, and which does indeed match the robes that lady was wearing, they directed that the ground be dug on that spot. When they found the coffin, they had it opened in 2 places over the chest and face, as you see in this image, and the cerecloth around the head unwrapped, revealing the features and particularly the eyes in perfect preservation. Suddenly alarmed at the sight, however, and disgusted by the smell from the cerecloth, they had the grave filled in again, without even replacing the cloth or lead coffin covering. This story was related to the Society of Antiquaries in 1787 by the Reverend Treadway Nash, who we're going to hear more of in a minute, and seems believable enough as he was writing just 5 years later, had been to Catherine's grave himself, and evidently spoken to those present during the initial opening of her coffin. We have another account written by someone who saw her remains in the 1780s though, which doesn't tally with this story. This is a second-hand account of the discovery of Catherine's remains, written by a Mr. Brooks of Reading. He stated that a John Lucas, who was a tenant of Lord Rivers, found Catherine in the summer of 1782, just where she had been left in 1548, in a leaden coffin, approximately 2 feet beneath the surface, and with the breastplate still in place with its inscription. According to Brooks, John Lucas decided that he wanted to see the dead queen for himself, and so tore open the top of the coffin and exposed the body. Lucas, who had anticipated only a skeleton, to his great surprise found the whole body wrapped in 6 or 7 cerecloths of linen entire and uncorrupted, although it had lain there upwards of 230 years. His unwarrantable curiosity led him also to make an incision through the cerecloths which covered one of the arms of the corpse, the flesh of which at that time was white and moist. I was very much displeased at the forwardness of Lucas, who of his own head opened the coffin. It would have been quite sufficient to have found it, and then to have made a report of it to Lord Rivers or myself. There is no mention of any women here, or of Catherine's face being exposed. Brooks may have expressed indignation at the mistreatment of her remains by Lucas, however he soon proved that he wasn't any better. The following summer he and his son were at Sudeley, and having heard Lucas's account of what had happened in 1782, Brooks wrote that, "I directed the earth to be once more removed to satisfy my own curiosity, and found Lucas's account of the coffin and corpse to be just as he had represented them, with this difference, that the body was then grown quite fetid, and the flesh where the incision had been made was brown and in a state of putrefaction, in consequence of the air having been let in upon it. The stench of the corpse made my son quite sick." Brooks Jr. nevertheless copied out the transcription on Catherine's coffin plate, and the grave was filled in again. There are a few things I'd like to note from these 2 episodes. First, it's really not clear if Catherine's tomb was opened twice in 1782 or not. Perhaps the story of the women was made up to deflect blame away from John Lucas for having opened up the grave and damaged the body in such a way that it rapidly decomposed. If her face had been exposed to the air at that point, why did Brooks not mention it when describing his view of the body in 1783? Instead, he says only that her arm was exposed and rotting. It's conceivable that he was the one who first exposed her face, then put about the story that it had been done the previous year so that he wouldn't have to take responsibility for his actions. Equally, Brooks may have written his account much later and made errors in the details. The earliest published version of it I can find dates to 1857, when he would have been long dead, and had been provided by his daughter Julia. Maybe she even tweaked some of the details to paint her father in a better light. Second, in my opinion, I don't see that it was necessary to dig Catherine up at all. Had she not been famous, no one would have cared about her burial. The exact spot her tomb was in was no longer known, but the general location of her burial, probably to within a matter of 50 feet inside the ruined chapel, was still remembered. There was also no question of her remains being anyone else, and there was no great mystery around her cause of death that a view of her body might have solved. Unlike when Anne Boleyn was disinterred, Catherine also wasn't dug up because repairs had to be made to the fabric of the building in which her remains were housed. Despite his complaints about Lucas's behaviour, Brooks was perfectly upfront about the fact that he reopened Catherine's grave for the exact same reasons a year later, his own curiosity. I agree with his initial assessment that once the coffin had been located, it should have been reburied and left alone. The lead plate on it made it perfectly clear who it contained. Third, from the contemporary description and drawing of her body, Catherine is an excellent example of just what a good and quick embalming combined with an airtight lead coffin can achieve. Her remains were in remarkable condition, and had she just been left alone, they'd no doubt have remained that way for much longer. Yet as soon as her coffin was opened and her wrappings pierced, the body began to rot at a highly accelerated pace, which is why Brooke Sr. and Jr. found her in such disgusting condition just a year after the first breach. Things were going to get much worse, however. Now that the knowledge of exactly where she could be found was out, and it was known what a shallow grave she was in, it was open season on the Queen's body. The 19th century historical writer Agnes Strickland said that a friend of hers named Jane Porter was told several years after the event by an old woman that the coffin had been opened in 1784 by a band of ruffians and the remains thrown on a rubbish heap. According to this woman, Catherine had been wearing the remains of costly burial clothes, specifically a dress and shoes, and her feet were very small and all her proportions extremely delicate. The lady even said that Catherine was still beautiful with perfect features, but she rapidly began to decay. Again, this account doesn't chime at all with the idea that her face had been exposed to the elements since 1782. The body was then apparently reburied at the insistence of the local vicar. To be honest, I have my doubts about this story. It's a third-hand account traced back to an unnamed woman Strickland says was ancient and remembering an event from years earlier. The claim that Catherine was wearing clothes also doesn't match any other account, all of which talk only about the cerecloth the body was wrapped in. This is a very weak, poorly referenced chain of evidence, and it's possible that this story, if it happened at all, is being confused with a later opening in 1792, which I'll come to shortly. First, however, we return to a much more reliable account, that of Treadway Nash, who wrote that he and a few others exhumed Catherine on the 14th of October 1786 and made what was by 18th century standards a scientific study of her remains. He declared that, upon opening the ground and heaving up the lead, we found the face totally decayed, the bones only remaining. The teeth, which were sound, had fallen out of their sockets. The body, I believe, is perfect, as it has never been opened. We thought it indelicate and indecent to uncover it, but observing the left hand to lie at a small distance from the body, we took off the cerecloth and found the hand and nails perfect, but of a brownish colour. The cerecloth consisted of many folds of coarse linen dipped in wax, tar, and perhaps some gums. Over this was wrapped a sheet of lead fitted exactly close to the body. He added that he'd seen no wooden coffin remaining and that Catherine must have been petite because the lead around her body was only 5 feet 4 inches long. Nash also noted that rabbits were able to scratch very irreverently about the royal corpse in its current location, and wished that the Queen might be soldered up in a new coffin and buried somewhere safer, where she couldn't be constantly disinterred. A bit ironic given what he'd just done, but there you go. This wasn't done, and for that reason, in 1792, Catherine would suffer her worst desecration. We have an account of what happened from a contemporary magazine. This states that, early in 1792, 2 men showed up at Sudeley Castle, apparently with the intention of stealing Catherine's body. They were sent away by a relation of the tenant, this might therefore have been a relation of John Lucas, and it was decided that for her own protection, Catherine's grave should be made more secure. This tenant therefore ordered some of his servants to dig a new, much deeper grave in the late spring or early summer. This episode turned into a complete disaster, however, and it's the reason I list Catherine as the victim of one of the worst royal grave desecrations I'm aware of. Here's what apparently happened. An invitation to dine was given to several neighbours, and after dinner all the persons present, except the tenant, attended to remove the body. Unfortunately for the remains, the glass had circulated too quickly, and when the body was taken up, 'tis shocking to relate or even to think of this infernal business, some of them proceeded to the greatest indecencies, by pulling off her hair, of a beautiful yellow, and knocking her teeth out, then with a spade cut off her head, and violently pulled off her arms, and even proceeded to a higher pitch of brutality by stabbing an iron bar several times through her, then threw the mutilated body into the new grave. After this bunch of frankly depraved drunks were done with her, Catherine was left until the 18th of July 1817, when she was disinterred again at the behest of the Reverend John Lates, then Bishop of Sudeley, with a view to righting some of the wrongs which had been done to her. One of the men present, a Mr. E.T. Brown, later described the events of that day. Her coffin was found upside down in a walled grave where it had supposedly been placed on the orders of John Lucas. There was now nothing left of Catherine, whose body had been in perfect condition just 35 years earlier, except a skeleton, a clump of dirty hair, and a few pieces of cerecloth under her skull. Numerous pieces of her hair had been taken during the previous openings, so much so that Brown was able to compare this dirty clump after washing to a lock he already had in his possession, and Catherine was described as having blonde or golden auburn hair, which tended to curl naturally. I couldn't find a public domain or Creative Commons image of any of these locks, but if you want to do a quick Google search, you will certainly see some of them, and it definitely looks blonde to me, which is interesting because this doesn't match up with what we see in a lot of portraits of Catherine. There are also images of some purported teeth of the Queen available online. Ivy had penetrated the heavily damaged coffin and was growing throughout it, but the breastplate with the original inscription was found and a rubbing made of it, which is where this image comes from. Brown had the pieces of the broken coffin nailed back together to reform its shape and measured them. Contrary to what Nash had said in 1787, the coffin was now 5 feet 10 inches long, though it may well be that having been broken and put back together, its dimensions had changed. This reconstituted coffin was placed in the nearby tomb of Lord Chandos in St Mary's Chapel at Sudeley Castle, and has remained there ever since, though when we look at this 1850 image of the chapel, it must be said that it wasn't in great shape either. The last fragment of her original effigy was placed behind a small iron grate, which can be seen in this image published in the 1870s, but I'm unaware if it's still in existence today. Perhaps if someone listening has been to visit Sudeley Castle, they can let me know in the comments. This new monument was erected to the Queen in the 19th century, however, and unlike her previous one, it has so far remained intact, and can still be seen today if you visit what is hopefully Catherine's final resting place. This brings us to the end of this week's video. Remember to give it a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel, and let me know below what you think of the treatment of Catherine's remains in the 1780s and 90s. If you're in the mood for some more Tudor bodies, try my videos on the disinterment of Anne Boleyn and others by the Victorians, or on whether or not Henry VIII's body exploded after his death. I'll be back next week with a new video, and until then, keep learning.